Hello, I'm John Pasalis, and welcome to another episode of the Move Smartly Show. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Matt Young, CEO of Republic Developments in Toronto. Matt's going to be speaking with us about an important issue right now, which is the taxes on housing and how this is impacting housing costs and future housing development. Matt is behind an initiative called CantWin, which has been supported by a number of developers trying to get governments to lower the taxes on new housing, which they intend to flow through to lower housing costs for people buying new housing. We think it's an important initiative, in particular during a time when construction has halted. If governments are ever going to lower the taxes on housing, the important time to do it is now, when more of those reductions will actually flow through to lower prices. So Matt's going to be talking to us about that, his thoughts on the future of housing over the next year or two, especially in an environment where things are kind of sluggish, and what it might take for us to see more housing sales and eventually more housing starts in the future. If you have any questions about this episode, you can reach me at askjohn@movesmartly.com. And now on to today's show.
Great. Well, welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So to start, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your work and what you do in the building industry.
So I'm a home builder. I'm a high-rise home builder. I've been in the business for 15 years. I started my company about 5 years ago, beginning of 2020. I had perfect timing just before the pandemic. But since I started that business, we've been generally buying high-rise development sites on transit around the GTA. So we launched our first site last year and sort of experiencing the changing market, I would say. But really our goal is to build housing. That's our number one focus.
Great. So are you at the starting end of your process with these sites, or are you actively building right now?
We're not actively building anything yet. Most of our sites are approved. And so we're now sort of in a bit of a waiting period to see where the market's going and what's going to happen. But we've got a lot of pipeline, but just nothing under construction quite yet.
A bit of a common theme happening right now. So before we get into the actual market dynamics,
Sure.
why don't you tell us a little bit more about a very interesting tax reform pledge that you, along with several leading developers, have launched called CantWin. Can you tell us about what this pledge is and what the message you're trying to get across to politicians is?
Yeah, of course. So, I kind of alluded on it a second ago, but, we launched our first project in October of last year, as I think we all saw a very steep decline in housing sales as a result of interest rates and really as a result of unaffordability. And so back in October of last year, as that was happening, we and our team at Republic were looking at, we were talking to agents and talking to clients and talking to people who, purchased but then rescinded, or people who were on the edge of purchasing but didn't quite do it, and trying to get feedback from them. And the number one thing was affordability. They just said, like, we're not really sure where the world's going, and things feel very unaffordable right now. So we just don't want to take the risk to purchase something today. And that's a valid concern because, housing is expensive and it's generally the biggest purchase anybody makes. So we kind of looked at, why are things unaffordable? Because we always hear this narrative that it's, these big bad developers and they're making too much profit. And I know as a developer that that's not the case. But we wanted to really dig into why costs were what they were and why we had to sell for the prices we had to sell for. And so we did a deep dive of a typical pro forma we do. They generally have about 350 line items in the budget. And so we looked line item by line item, every single one of them, to see what can reasonably be removed from this in order to bring prices down. And so when you think of a typical development pro forma, you've got, your land costs and your soft costs and your financing costs and your hard costs. And within that, land typically is somewhere around 5 to 10% of the cost of a project. So there's also been this narrative that land prices are too high, and perhaps that's the case for certain low-rise areas, but for high-rise, that's absolutely not the case. It's 5 to 10% of the cost of a home is the land. And that has actually compressed significantly in the last 2 years. The next one is soft costs, which are all your consultants and your lawyers and your application fees and all the other things that go into creating the project. And, everybody else is experiencing inflation. So I'm not sure it's reasonable to expect that your architects are going to take a haircut on their fees, or your lawyers, or well, maybe the lawyers should take a haircut on their fees, but ultimately everybody is feeling the pinch. And so, labor costs are not really going down. And so there's not much room there. Financing costs, we know, are up as a result of interest rates. Construction costs are coming down, but coming down very slightly, because ultimately construction is made up of generally two things: labor and materials. And materials are generally a global market. So, it's commodities, and commodity prices aren't really moving that much, down that much. And labor is going up every year because of inflation and because of, collective bargaining. So construction costs have gone down a little bit, where some trades were, I think, taking advantage of a very, very undersupplied market in terms of the actual labor. Like formwork has come down and earthworks has come down, but it's been a couple percent. It hasn't been meaningful. So then what we looked at was taxes, which was kind of the other component of it. And we compared a project from 2009 to today, and the taxes went from 12% of the cost of the home then to roughly 30% today. And more importantly, the cost of the home has actually tripled. So the taxes have gone up almost 600%. And so clearly that is an area where there's been an enormous change in the last 15 years. And it's the thing that we said we need to really focus on. So to take this back, a long-winded answer, but to take it back to the Can't campaign, we said that that's the number one thing we can do to immediately address the housing unaffordability crisis, where we can actually bring costs down, is if you cut taxes, which is, really in the government's hands. They could do that tomorrow if they wanted. We can bring prices down. And so the concept of the pledge really came from this, general narrative that developers are greedy and just want to take all the money. And we said, no, like that's not really the case. We're going to get a group of developers together who will put their names and their reputations on the line to say that we will drop our prices dollar for every dollar saved from any tax reform that happens. So that was the launch of the campaign. It happened in August. That was what the campaign was all about. We got tremendous feedback. We had a ton of media coverage on it, and I think the message was really clear to the public that we are not the greedy ones in this case. Government has been greedy for the last 15 years, and unfortunately, the system is broken, and so they're going to have to adjust their expectations moving forward.
And I understand this week you are going to be heading towards a phase 2 of this campaign.
Yeah. So phase 1 of the campaign was really about an honest, transparent discourse with government, and providing, I guess, hopefully providing some comfort to the public and government that any changes they do around tax reform would directly benefit purchasers. That was really the goal. And we've had a lot of discussions with government since that campaign started, since the beginning of August. A lot of positive discussions, some less positive discussions, but for the most part positive. But we haven't really seen any action on it until actually this week. And I have to commend the Conservatives, Pierre and his team, because they were the first level of government to meaningfully come out with policy reform that they're proposing. So that's encouraging, but the government in power, who actually has the ability to make changes today, has not done anything yet. So the next phase of the campaign is really around communicating to the public about the problem. So I think I can probably say this because it's not out yet, but I think by the time this podcast comes out, it will be. We're launching a board game called Taxopoly, which is a little spin on Monopoly, but it's called Taxopoly, the unwinnable game of Canadian home ownership. So it's actually a playable board game, but after about 3 turns, you lose all your money and you go bankrupt, which is very much like how it feels for young people trying to buy a home today. And it's being sent to government officials, to media, to housing influencers, to anybody who's willing to get the message out there, to really highlight that taxes are the number one issue causing housing unaffordability, and the government has to fix this problem.
All right.
That's
A fun
super
take,
helpful.
a fun take on a very serious problem.
Yeah.
John, over to you. I'm wondering about some of these numbers, whether we can unpack pro forma. I'm hearing several other insider terms that might be good to break down.
Yeah, I mean, before I mean, I had a couple of questions with the taxes that you talked about, but I guess the first thing just to clarify is that your campaign larger, the pledge is largely focused on, it sounds like owner-occupied homes, because the Liberals have cut sort of taxes on purpose-built rentals, but not on end user kind of owner-occupied condos or houses. Does that kind of sound about right? Like,
Yeah, correct.
okay.
And actually, we actually gave them credit in the letter for some of the policies that they've implemented. Some of them have been good. Others have not been so great. But around the rental piece, and I think it's important to note this, rentals got the benefit because it looks like it's helping, people who can't afford homes and people who need more help. And that's great. But all of these purpose-built rentals that are being built are generally luxury rentals. And that's a fact. If you look in the big cities, most of the stuff being built are luxury rentals. And if you actually take one of those luxury rentals, and there's plenty of examples of this that I could give you, but you take a condo, a brand new condo directly next door to it, and you compare the rental prices in each building, the condo is cheaper. And the reason it's cheaper is because it's owned by fragmented owners. It's, that building might have 300 or 400 different owners in the building, and all of those people need to pay their mortgage. And so they're going to make sure they get their unit leased and rented no matter what. And most of these units end up going into the rental stock. So there's no benefit in vilifying ownership versus rental, because most of this ownership stock turns into rental stock, but it actually turns into more affordable rental stock, because it's not owned by one singular pension plan who has the ability to wait out for the highest rents, and they care more about their asset value than the extra $200 or a couple months of rent that they might miss out. So they're willing to hold out and wait to get their sticker price on the rents, and they're able to do that. 300 or 400 owners of condos are not able to do that, and they will just rent and compete with each other until prices normalize to where the market can bear. So there's really no benefit in for the government or for Canadians or anyone to vilify ownership. We should be championing the idea of ownership, whether it's used as an end user to live in it or whether it's used as rental stock.
So when you talk about the taxes on housing, maybe for the average viewer or listener, maybe you can kind of unpack the key ones that obviously impact the new housing. Like just the key taxes federally, provincially, municipally that impact these high costs.
Sure. So we looked, first of all, every municipality is a little bit different. Every province is a bit different. We were clearly focused on the city of Toronto, the province of Ontario, and Canada as a whole, because that's where most of this coalition is from. When we did our math, we looked at what we would call a typical high-rise building, which is most of the product that's being built. So we tried to do a prototypical average market project, and roughly the taxes came to about 30%, just shy of 30%. And that's taxes plus interest charges on those taxes, because some of those taxes are paid up front and you then pay interest on it. So there's three that really stand out. There's a number of taxes that account for 0.5% or 1%, but there's three that really stand out. The first one is the HST. So when we sell homes today and a purchaser buys a home, it's inclusive of HST. So they are actually paying the tax. It's just kind of hidden in the purchase price. That accounts for upwards of 10% of the cost of a home. So, and in some cases, a little bit more. The next one is development charges. We've talked about development charges. It's gone up 1,200% in the last 15 years in the city of Toronto. Those account for roughly 10% of the cost of a home as well. And then the next one that we're really focused on is the double land transfer tax, which Toronto is the only municipality in the country that has a double land transfer tax. Ontario charges one and Toronto charges one. That effectively amounts to 4% of the cost of the home. And that is directly paid by the purchaser at closing on their statement of adjustments. So, or to the government. So those three taxes collectively amount to, give or take, plus the interest amounts to give or take 25% of the cost of a home. So we are really focused on those three. There's other taxes like community benefits charges and parkland and education levies, and some of those taxes are not necessarily bad things. Maybe they could be a little bit lower, but they're not bad things. I think it's good to have parks in a city, but the three other ones were the lowest hanging fruit and the ones that need to see immediate action, because they're going to move the needle the most on housing prices.
Sounds good. And now, out of those, I mean, it seems like the HST, of course, is a constant percentage of the sale price. That hasn't changed in 10 years, right? I mean, obviously it's increasing, but it's increasing with the value of homes. But development charges, it feels like it's a little bit more of a Wild West that has surged way higher. Mike Moffat just posted a chart. I don't know, economist Mike Moffat, maybe like a couple days ago, where he showed the change in development charges for a one-bedroom condo in 2010 versus 2014. And they basically went from just under 5,000 to just under 50,000. And this is
it's unhinged. It's completely unhinged.
Right. I mean, and exactly. Now, of course, they should be higher, but if they'd appreciated at the rate of housing costs, development charges would be maybe 12,000 a unit rather than 50,000. Right. So when we think about sort of what do you think is behind this? Because obviously this growth in development charges is significantly outpacing the growth in house prices. What do you think is kind of motivating the municipalities to rapidly increase sort of the tax on housing this way?
So, and I actually want to go back to the HST in a second, but I'll talk about this first. So I think what's happened, I started in this business in 2009, just after the recession. And basically from 2009 to a couple of years ago, we've had almost uninterrupted growth. There's been little dips here and there, but almost uninterrupted growth. What's generally happened is interest rates have generally progressively fallen over that period of time. Immigration has increased. Housing starts have not materially moved. And so prices kept going up. And as prices kept going up, land prices were going up, everything was going up. I think governments looked at it and said, hey, we need to get our piece of the pie. We need to capture some of that. How do we capture some of those land value increases? And so what they did was very aggressively, I think, raise development charges under this kind of the guise of growth paying for growth. Now, I think the way they do their math, and there's been a number of people much smarter than me, guys like Mike Moffat, who have dug into this. And I know ResCon and Build and other groups are digging into this now. There's a lot of fluff added into what they consider necessary expenses. Development charges are meant to pay for sewers and roads and key infrastructure to allow that growth to happen. Why are development charges paying for transit lines, for example? Everybody in the city benefits from a transit line. Why isn't everybody paying for that? And on top of that, the other thing that I find completely egregious is that we actually pay for our own infrastructure investments through cash when we build a project. So if I have a project that doesn't have a sewer capacity, or I need to upgrade the sewer to accommodate the 500 units, the city of Toronto charges me for that. I'll pay $500,000, $1 million, $2 million to upgrade that infrastructure out of my construction costs. And then on top of that, I pay the development charge, which is meant to cover other parts of the city. So it's completely double dipping. And they've only been able to get away with it because I think the market has progressively been increasing, and the development industry has had a really strong run for 15 years. And I think, we probably took our foot off the gas. I think the industry itself took its foot off the gas in terms of fighting these things because things were okay. But as soon as, rates started going up and all of a sudden the buyers fled the market, things are not okay anymore. And now the industry is effectively dead. So government has to look within and think, okay, maybe we were being a little bit greedy through these last 15 years. Maybe we need to adjust our expectations down if we want to keep building housing for people. So I think that's what's happened. And I just want to quickly go back to the HST because you mentioned that goes up with the price of a home. So it's sort of a constant. That is true and also not true. When HST got implemented, there was a rebate, and the home prices were less than a third of what they are today. And so the effective HST, when I got in the business, the effective HST you paid was like 4.5 to 5% of the cost of a home when you factored in your rebate. That rebate and the thresholds for the rebate haven't changed. So as prices have gone up, you're now paying 13% on every dollar above those numbers. And so now we're paying 10, 11% net of any rebate on the cost of a home. So actually the HST has significantly increased as a result of that. And I think when you look at what Pierre is trying to do, by basically creating $1 million threshold with a full rebate of the HST, it's really that. It's reflecting where housing prices have gone and trying to right size, how that works. I do think there's some flaws in the way they've done it, but I think it's an incredible first step. So not taking anything away from what they're doing, I'm very encouraged by what they're doing, but I think there's some tweaks that could be done to make it even better.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks, Matt. You've actually touched on a couple of things that let's just say, don't always quite understand about the developer fee, the taxes argument. So hopefully you can answer a few of them. What if it's the case that the municipalities aren't being greedy, but are in fact catching up for infrastructure that wasn't adequately paid for, as we saw an explosion of home building, as you said, in a very strong market over several decades now. We saw high rises completely transform Toronto, downtown Toronto, and we've seen the suburbs, where I'm from, Richmond Hill and beyond, field after field turn into rows and rows of subdivisions of homes. Clearly, housing is not a product that you can sell on its own. So the argument of who should pay for what and who is using the benefits of what, I wonder if they're as clear cut as you're saying. For example, you say, transit is used by everyone, but you just also mentioned that your own development company likes to invest in land around transit hubs. Obviously, there is some kind of benefit to homeowners, whether they're using it for end use or using these as rentals for being around these projects. The same case of exploding municipalities, where you see mayors of Newmarket and Aurora arguing that the problem with the whole build it, we take some tax and then we'll put in the sewer is it's the whole equation is putting a lot of stress on municipalities. In fact, their argument is that when, for example, Pierre and others suggest that they should penalize municipal governments for not creating enough housing starts, they're actually getting less money to put in the infrastructure they would need to improve the housing starts. So I think both sides are playing a bit of kick a ball, or I don't know, kick the ball down the road or something here. And to the point where the mayor of Aurora, I believe, wants to introduce a bill saying they want a bigger cut of the HST and a bigger cut of land transfer tax revenue from the governments to help them keep up with this phenomenal pace of growth. So I'm not sure it's quite true that's one-to-one. You put in a house, you get a little water. There is a tremendous infrastructure bill that needs to happen, and I would argue the case of downtown Toronto and its transit situation and our clogged roads are a great example of when you don't have that money and you don't put in that infrastructure.
So let me address a couple of things. I want to ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can definitely play the back and forth with municipalities, and that's obviously what's been happening. But if you actually dig deeper into the data, you'll find that what they're saying doesn't hold a lot of truth. So City of Toronto, for example, is sitting on over $5 billion of excess capital budget that they haven't spent. That number has gone up consistently for the last 10 years. They're actually growing their capital reserves. They're not spending the money they're getting. So why are you sitting charging, a first-time home buyer 55, 60, 70 grand in development charges on a unit, making their unit unaffordable when you're not spending the money you have? So if you actually just peel back one layer of the onion, you don't even have to go that deep. You'll realize that the municipalities are not being, they're being disingenuous when they say that completely. In terms of the transit argument, I agree. Toronto has massively underspent and underinvested in transit. The best time to build transit was 20 years ago. The next best time is tomorrow. So they should have been building things 20 years ago. And what happened was you had different governments, and every new government comes in and wants to put their own little spin, and they They study and they study and they study and they change and they change and they change, and nothing happened. Finally, things are getting built now. Things like the Downtown Relief Line or the Ontario Line, other transit projects are being built, but everybody in the city is going to benefit from those. So why are you going to put the burden of building transit, which could have been built for probably 1/10 the cost 20 years ago? You're now going to put that on the 20 to 25,000 new homes that get built in Toronto every year. So those first-time home buyers and young people are the ones who have to bear the burden. And someone living in a $2 million home whose kids get to take the subway every day don't have to pay their fair share of that. I think that's completely nonsense. That's ridiculous. No rational or reasonable person would think that it's fair to burden 20,000 people every year with that cost instead of sharing that cost from 1 million or 2 million people.
I mean, except for our mayors who have refused to increase property taxes, for years.
But again, I mean, I think there's a lot to the argument, but I think we're getting back to the user fee model or consumption model, which is what HST and other things tax versus a broad-based tax system. So I do take a lot of, Matt, what you're saying very seriously. Peter Wallace, who was a former manager of the city of Toronto, somebody that I really admire in government, has said that efficiency when it comes to government spending has always been an issue. But I do think that if we're to be educated as citizens, we should also realize that massive capital reserves are for infrastructure that is not being kept up by anybody. This includes gardeners. The numbers sound huge, but when the city of Toronto owns the gardener and is responsible for the DVP, and we see half of it literally hanging in the sky right now, they are undertaking massive infrastructure costs. So I guess my question to you is, I take your point that many political parties and political actors have fallen asleep at the wheel. And a lot of the pre-planning that should have been done alongside this growth, let's say, in all these cities or neighborhoods that were once not really in play, that are now like coveted neighborhoods and areas to live in. Let's say along the way, the governments did not properly tax and do what they needed to do, working with the industries and other actors. So now they're playing catch up, and they're doing it in a way that's hard to, quite frankly, I take your point, hard to account for in all cases. But I guess my argument then goes to your second point, which is why, when condos were going up and selling for exploding prices for square foot downtown, did we hear less of this argument 2 years ago? Isn't it the case that the development industry was more able to look, not complain then, because right now it's a situation in which their sales are down? So really, this is a case.
That's obvious. Anybody, when things are going well, you're not going to sit and spend your energy trying to fix something that isn't broken. You're going to spend your energy capitalizing on things going well. You're going to be focused on buying more land and building more homes. That's what happened. As soon as interest rates changed and demand changed, and I would call it irrational exuberance, left the market, you now have a dead market. So we don't even really need to bait it. The fact is, the market's dead. The market will not come back until housing prices are at a point where people feel the pricing makes sense. And the only way to get the pricing there is to remove taxes. It is the singular way that they can fix this. Unless they want to go like Texas style model, where there's no rezoning, you just, whatever you want to get built, you submit it and you get it built and it's approved in 30 days. And if you want to cut 2 years out of a schedule and, millions of dollars in cost and reports and things like that, that would be a way to do it. But I don't think the cities want to give up that power. So then they're going to have to give up the taxes. One of the two things has to happen, or interest rates have to go back to, 2% again. And we go back to a chaotic, unrealistic, unsustainable housing market. It's just, the facts are there. I actually think if you look at interest rates today, I remember when I was in university and growing up, this is a historically normal interest rate, I would say. You can get a 5-year mortgage for under 5%. It's high compared to the 1.5% to 2% that people were seeing during COVID, but 5% or 4.5% is not that crazy. So if we can't make the housing industry work at that interest rate, then something else in the system is broken.
Yeah.
I just believe that's true.
And before turning it over to John to discuss more about Pierre and other political proposals, I guess, what do you make of the criticism of the building industry that one part of the costs, the construction labor costs, is something that the industry really should have been taking a hold of, doing something about for many, many years? It seems like the argument of having declining number of people entering the trades, not being able to train enough people, having a really tightly supplied labor market has been a longstanding complaint. And even amongst record-making immigration, it seems like the industry didn't really advocate to take some of that immigration to do anything about this problem. And secondly, there's an argument that there are newer building techniques and that some builders are perhaps not as fast to use them or introduce them, and in that way reduce material costs and other things.
Yeah, so on the labor side, I actually think, the industry often, we often do fight on the labor front. It's not us as developers, but there's unions are renegotiating contracts every 3 or so years, and there's been times where projects stall as those contracts are being negotiated. People walk off sites, and so you got to kind of toe a line about how hard you push, and you have to be reasonable. You also have to recognize that cost of living is getting higher, and those are really good quality, well-paying jobs. And so they should be well-paying jobs. It's hard work. People should get paid an honest living to do that work. And I think, they've certainly probably benefited from a shortage of labor. I think that's true. But populations are we're having too few kids here, and so we're relying completely on immigration. And a lot of the immigration that's coming here is not, it's students and other things. So I've actually been advocating that we should be leveraging our immigration system. So many people around the world want to come to Canada. We should be moving people to the top of the pile if they're willing to take on those types of jobs. There should be some sort of integration between the job needed in the country, whether it's construction, doctors, nurses, whatever it might be. There should be an integration between that and who is getting first access into the country. That should be the priority number one. Temporary foreign workers or students, while I think an amount of that is good, it shouldn't take precedent over, getting farm workers or electricians or plumbers who work in another country who want to be in Canada. We should be prioritizing those people and fast tracking them to immigration, because you're not going to be able to get young people into the trades quickly enough. I think there has been a lot of effort to try and make it easier for young people to get into the trades and giving them different paths other than university. And I think that's positive, but that takes a long time, right? It's going to take years for those people to go through the process and get those jobs. And if we need immediate action, you need to rely on immigration for that. So we probably could have done a better job there. But I think at the end of the day, there's now a lot of, as a result of the slowdown, there's a lot of construction companies who are laying off staff. When we launched our campaign a few weeks before in August, it would have been middle of July or so, I was talking to a friend of mine who works at a big construction management firm, and he said one of their farm workers had laid off 400 men that week, 400 people from one company. Like, that's crazy. Those are really good paying jobs. Those are important jobs to be keeping. And so now we're the opposite issue, which is there's not enough work. And so ultimately we need to get housing built again. We need to get starts happening again. And then we can solve that problem later.
Over to Polyev. I've been calling him Pierre. I'm not as familiar with him as you are, Matt. Sorry.
You touched on earlier on the Conservatives' announcement about waiving the federal portion of HST or GST on new housing. I think I think CantWin was kind of very supportive of that, of course. One question I had though is, what makes me kind of wonder sometimes is, to what extent can all of these reforms happen in a silo? Like, okay, yeah, maybe the feds cut HST, but if the municipalities just keep supercharging development charges and quite frankly see that cut in taxes as an opportunity to increase their own taxes, are we that further ahead? Like, does something have to be a little bit more coordinated for actually to have a meaningful impact?
Yeah, you're completely right. There is probably a risk of that. I think there has been an attempt, certainly by us, and I think other industry organizations, to try to coordinate an effort amongst levels of government. We've actually been trying to set up meetings that are joint meetings with the municipality, with Mayor Chow's office, with Paul Calander's office, with Sean Fraser's office. We have not had any of those meetings yet. Every meeting we've had has unfortunately been, kind of siloed with just that group. But we've been advocating in those meetings that, look, you need to be communicating with all levels of government to coordinate an effort here. And, I think ultimately, what Pierre is doing right now is putting out policy positions in anticipation of an upcoming election, whether it happens sooner than, October next year. But he is, I think, smartly developing policies that make sense and putting them out there for the world to see in anticipation of an election. So if he does get elected, people are going to be expecting that's part of his mandate and that he's going to do those things. The current government in power, I think, is kind of sitting around and being slow to act. And I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. I do believe that they are aware there's a problem. In fact, I know they're aware there's a problem. Pretty much every level of government we've met with has recognized that there is a problem. The question is, what is their response going to be? And I'm hearing that there's going to be some small response from the City of Toronto sometime in November. But they also just raised development charges 42% in the past 3 or 4 months. So if they're not cutting them at least that or more than that, then they really haven't moved the needle at all. So yeah, to answer your question, there is a bit of a risk of that, but ultimately, it starts with leadership in one place. And if you get enough of the public to pay attention to the issue and to care about the issue, then I think governments will eventually act in their best interest, which is, okay, we see this as a problem. Housing's not happening. We're not going to get the taxes anyway. We probably need to do something to show that we're swimming in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, now in the federal government's defense, and I'm not a big advocate of federal government's housing policy, I mean, it feels like they're kind of responding to the situations at the time. It's kind of like what you said, like 2 years ago, no one was really talking about taxes on housing as much. Everyone was talking about legalizing housing, legalizing fourplexes. This is the solution. They did that. Fast forward to
zoning,
yeah, like that's what their whole mandate was, like their housing accelerator fund, right? So it seems like this is what they were pushing, because this, quite frankly, is what most housing economists and advocates were arguing for 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And they did that. It hasn't really changed too much. Like we haven't really seen everyone building fourplexes. And today, like, and your arguments are valid, but we're in a very different environment, right?
Absolutely.
And who knows what they'll do, but it feels like they're kind of just potentially gonna have to play catch up and adjust their policies to the new environment and the new issues that are coming up that are kind of constraining the supply of housing is kind of what I feel like in their defense.
No, you're absolutely right. And like I said before, in our letter, we actually encourage them, and we're complimentary of some of the things that the federal government and other levels of government have done around housing. But it's a very dynamic market. Things change quickly. It's a complicated market too. So you have to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. For example, the Housing Accelerator Fund, the focus on that fund was to approve more housing. It wasn't to build more housing. A home, I've said this many times now, but a home is not a home until the keys are in someone's hand and they can move in and they can. So if you incentivize just approving housing, that's great. And that's a good first step. But if you just approve housing and none of it gets built because the conditions aren't there to build it, you've built zero housing. And so I actually think some of those policies that they've implemented, like hindsight's always 2020, but I think they were somewhat flawed in that they didn't incentivize the actual construction of getting a home built, which would imply you have to get the zoning. and you have to get the permits, and you have to get financing, and you have to then build it, it would then mean governments have to look at fixing all or making sure that all of those things are working in unison. They only focused on the front end, which is approving it. So unfortunately, you can approve. We've got hundreds of thousands of units approved in the city. I've got myself 11,000 units approved. But if buyers aren't there to buy them and the economics aren't there to make sense of building them, then you just have a bunch of approved land. Meaningless. So I think they're going to have to move quicker on this. And actually, to give some credit to Sean Fraser's office, when I met with his team, they were pretty on the ball about what was going on. I have to give them some credit there. They understood that there's an issue. They recognize there's an issue. I think they want to do things. Anything tax related, unfortunately, then relies on the Minister of Finance as well, because they have to look at it. And I would say, I don't think the Minister of Finance office sees the issue in the same way that the Minister of Housing's office does. So, obviously nothing's going to happen if they don't agree with something. So, there's lots of credit to go around, but there's lots of blame as well. And at the end of the day, we can't look backwards. We got to look forwards. What needs to be done now is where their focus needs to be.
Agreed. Now, when it comes to these tax cuts, I mean, I'm sure you see a lot of these comments online from progressives who argue that this is just nonsense. It is just a government handout to builders. Now, I mean, I think you touched on it. Huh?
I knew that would come.
Well, I mean, listen, I think it is. I think you kind of touched on it earlier, but I mean, obviously I have my own thoughts on it, but I'm kind of obviously I want to hear your response to that, because I have a tension with some of these arguments. Obviously, I don't kind of buy all of them, but obviously curious to hear your kind of thoughts on that. And I think you touched on it earlier, but kind of good to unpack.
Yeah. So we knew that comment would come, and so we wanted to make sure when we put our letter out that we were very transparent about our intentions and what we were trying to do. When we put the letter out, it wasn't a bunch of builders hiding behind some coalition. It was builders who put their logo, their name, their signature right on the letter. And, reputation in this business is everything. So they are putting their reputations on the line because they know it's the right thing to do, is to pass on the savings. We also said in the letter that we would agree to any accountability measures that the government wants to implement to ensure that those savings get passed on. Now, there's some challenges to how this gets done long term, but that's not really what it's about. Any project that's in the market today, that is for sale today, those price lists are generally available. And John, you and your team could email any sales office, you get the full price list, you can see it, it's all available, everybody knows it, and there's lots of websites that publish the prices as well. So everybody knows what people's prices are. We believe that what will happen, and the way we see it playing out, is that, and we're actually planning for this now, is that any tax savings that happen, we will run those through a pro forma on a unit by unit basis, and we will adjust the pricing of those units one by one. And we will actually, I can't speak for every other developer, but we are willing to publish our previous prices and our new prices showing the tax savings. So if we do that, and the other 30 plus developers in our coalition all do that with their projects in market, you're going to have a meaningful chunk of the market lowering their prices, and it's going to force everybody else in the market to do the same. So that to us is the accountability measure, is that we've put our reputations on the line, and we will show that we've dropped our prices. But there's also complexity here, and you alluded to it. If the federal government drops HST, but then the city of Toronto raises development charges, well then we'll have to do the calculus and figure out what the actual savings, if any, were. And so, yeah, I think that's the way we see it playing out. And we're trying to be very, it's one of our core philosophies. And, we have these decrees in our business in Republic, and one of them is transparency. So our belief here is that it's much better to be very transparent about this issue, and we'll show the math, we'll show the public. So we're actually thinking of a plan already with our sales team on one of our projects. How do we demonstrate that if some of these things happen, how do we demonstrate the difference and show it to a purchaser? So, we're still working on how we'll do that, but I think there'll be something when a purchaser comes in to see that the savings, that they got, and we'll give the credit to the government for doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think that is important. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, but I think the whole progressive argument about being, you know, the money going to the builder, I mean, perhaps makes sense in a market where the demand for new housing exceeds supply and you have lineups out your door and people don't care. They're just going to pay 1,800. I mean, yeah, in that environment, slashing taxes, I mean, is largely going to go towards profits, I would imagine. Like there's no
Right.
incentive to lower. But in an environment where there's no sales, I mean, it's only natural like that builders will be flowing that through into lower prices because you're in the business of selling more units. I mean, it just seems natural to me.
100%. That's exactly the case. And we've advocated to government when we've met with them that, you know, timing is everything when it comes to policies like this. And now is the time to do this thing. You couldn't do this 3 years ago when the market was like high flying, but you can do this today. And then you don't need to rely as much on you know, the Bank of Canada dropping interest rates to unsustainably low levels because you'll have a system that functions. You know, we don't need housing going up 10% a year. I think steady, stable growth is what everybody wants in housing. So, yeah.
So you two are touching upon something that I remember from my very young policy days. One of my first assignments was to go to Brazil and help them, as a Canadian, understand an issue they were having, which is called fiscal wars, guerra fiscal, between different jurisdictions. It's very common to federal countries where you have the the feds, the province, the municipalities all taxing in different ways. I am very skeptical how much we can actually prevent the kind of positioning John was talking about from actually happening. And I wonder instead why, Matt, your industry isn't pushing on something that I would think might hold more promise, which is using the massive amount of financial power the federal government has to set up an alternate fund of financing for developers to counter market cycles when it's less advantageous for investment in housing projects because of prevailing interest rates. So, I mean, that's a different, you can lend to people at lower rates. This is starting to happen on the purpose building front, more and more for purpose building rentals. I'm surprised that a mechanism like that, at which we might try to get at the cost in a different way, in a more uniform way that could be applied across Canada, but then adjusted to local market specifics, wouldn't be something that would be of more interest to you and your group.
Well, I mean, to us, the question is how do you remove the most amount of input costs to lower the prices the greatest? So, you know, when taxes are 30% of the cost of a home, that's obviously low hanging fruit. That makes a lot of sense. There's already programs, CMHC's got programs, you know, around financing, but what does it really get you? Like, let's really understand the math. If I go out in the market today and I get a, you know, prime plus 1% loan, and I do a CMHC deal and I get, you know, prime minus 50 bips or something like that, I'm really saving like 1.5% on that loan. Now, these are just arbitrary numbers, but just saying you're saving about 1.5% on the loan. You know, so what is that going to save you in terms of the cost of your project? It's not going to save you that much. It's going to save you a couple points over the span of construction, over the span of the project. So I'm focused on the 30%, not the 2%. Those are things at the margins. And, you know, I do think there's innovative models, co-investment models, for example. And we've actually pitched an idea recently, and we're still in the middle of pitching it to different levels of government to help build more affordable housing. You know, and you know, we have what we think is an innovative model where we believe that we can deliver 20% affordable housing on, you know, on one of our projects. It would have effectively a zero cost to government, but it would rely on the government's balance sheet and things like that, guarantees and things like that to help support the construction of the project. And, you know, the response I got, and I won't say who, but the response I got from the first group that we spoke to was, we don't have a program like this. We need to stick to the programs that we already have. I'm like, okay, the programs you already have don't work. We're trying to give you an innovative model here that will get you more affordable housing for less dollars. And you're saying because you don't already have the program, you're not going to do it? Like, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. So I'm constantly frustrated about how slow government can be to act on important issues and how little innovation. You brought up the fact that, there's the home building industry is not really adapted and innovated in terms of ways of constructing things. And I agree with you. I think there's lots of movement there and things that we could do. But it's a slow moving industry. It's a complicated industry. It's a highly risky industry. And so big changes like that are tough to do immediately. It's not, we're not in the tech sector. Like, if you screw up on one project, you could be done for good. So people are obviously apprehensive about massive changes, but you can innovate on the business model side and in how you work with government, in ways that really have no meaningful financial impact on anyone other than supporting, building more housing or building more affordable housing. And I still find, often they just don't see the light. And, so
Definitely more reactive. Not You're not going to see a lot of creativity or cutting edge policy making there.
And I think ultimately it's where are the incentives, right? Politicians, they want to get reelected. They care about what voters care about and what voters, raise to them. So, a big part of our campaign with Kent is, if you go on our website, cantwin.ca, there's a tool where you can email all your representatives, all the provinces, federal government, and we did the city of Toronto as well, where you can just email everyone. It'll automatically pull up all the emails. There's a templated email, but you can write your own email. And we want to put tens of thousands of emails in everyone's inbox, everyone in government's inbox, to show them that this is an issue that people really care about. And I think until that Overton window changes and until they feel the pinch that, hey, if we don't do something here, we're going to have a tough time come election season, I think it's going to be hard to get anything done.
I think somebody should already know they're going to have a tough time come election
season. You would hope at this point.
You would hope. Matt, a final question then. So when we're hearing reports of a lot of builders turning towards, you talked about ownership versus the purpose-built rental market. We're hearing about builders turning towards the purpose-built rental market to make their projects make sense. Now, is it your opinion then that that's not because of the financing being offered and in some cases funding and partnerships, but because of some of the tax cuts being offered in that area? So HST reductions and other things. So or is this something that we're hearing that's not really true? There isn't this shift into purpose building. And there's two-parter there.
Okay, what I'd say is it's partially true. There's a shift in terms of what builders are doing because they're looking at purpose-built rental. Every condo builder in the city of Toronto right now is exploring doing their project as purpose-built rental. Every single one of them. That doesn't mean they're all getting done. Adrian Rocca, who is one of the leaders in building purpose-built rental in the city of Toronto, I think he was just on BNN last week. Talking about the fact that like the numbers just don't work, even for him, who's got the best and biggest pension funds behind him and a well-oiled machine in terms of how they build. They are struggling to make it make sense. So when residential builders are looking at it, they're looking at it because they know there's no path forward in the condo market at this point today. So they're just looking for a path. And in some ways, they're kicking the can down the road, kicking a problem today to turn it into a problem tomorrow. And so, they're looking at, okay, if I shift this to rental, is there a way to at least get shovels in the ground and get the projects built? And
but what makes it more viable, Matt? Is it that there's some government funding, there's some financing sources, like, what's making those numbers even marginally better than the building side?
Well, a couple things. So yes, some CMHC financing helps. Lower development charges helps. No HST helps. All those things help a little bit. But when you say viable, they're not financially viable from a return standpoint. People are basically saying, I have no return path. I'm not going to make any return on condos if I can't sell a condo. So I need to go to purpose-built rental where I'll make probably half the return I should be making. But their view is like, this is capital preservation. If I can get my money out of the deal, okay, I've saved my money instead of losing my money. So it's not that people are moving forward with it. And that's why you're seeing guys like Adrian and Tricon not really moving forward with a lot of new projects right now, They're not starting construction on new things right now because they're in the business of delivering a return on the rental side. If they don't have to start, they won't start. Whereas condo guys, and many of whom have raised money, and there's a clock on that money, they're like, okay, I can't really sit around and wait. I need to, get this money working for me and at least work towards getting my money out. There's also more equity required in those deals. Typically, rentals need more equity. So guys may find a way to make it pencil for them, but then they have to go out and raise equity, which is very tough in this market. So I'd say people are talking, but don't let the talks fool you. Wait until you see a lot of new purpose-built rental under construction from condominium developers. There's a few, but very, very few. There's not that many happening right now.
Interesting. And John, finally, the market dynamics going forward.
So yeah, I mean, we'll wrap up just with one last question. We kind of maxed out our time, but just, your general thoughts on what the next year or so look like with, as you said, condo sales, new construction being super sluggish, the Fed's announcing big changes to immigration. Like, what do you see kind of going forward in your industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2025 right now is probably going to be a really tough year, much like 2024 has been. It's nice to see interest rates coming down, and that will certainly help. Hopefully, bond yields also come down with that eventually. I'm encouraged by what Pierre has done, and I'm hopeful that the Liberals and Doug Ford and his government and Olivia Chow are paying attention. Generally, that policy position he's come out with has been very positively, it's been recognized as a positive thing. I haven't seen a lot of negative talk about it online. And so hopefully that gives some political cover for other levels of government to actually act, government who is in power to act and actually make changes happen. So I would say there's two possibilities. If nothing happens on the tax front next year, it's going to be a very, very slow year. We're going to see very few starts happen. And if meaningful change happens on the tax front, plus interest rate drops, I think we could maybe see the market start to come back at it's not going to be 2021, but I think it'll come back at a reasonable pace if you can drop prices, 25%, right? If my $1 million condo that I was selling before, I can sell now for 750,000, and it's a very similar price point to the resale market, I think you'll see buyers come back. That's just my opinion. But you're probably closer to this than me because you talk to buyers every day and your agents talk to buyers every day. So I'd be curious actually to know your thoughts on, what it would take for buyers to come back into the market.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you're talking about, I think makes sense. I mean, if prices come down that materially on new construction, I would think you'd get even a big change. Like, I think you'd start to see even more end users buying new construction. I know a lot of people say they don't buy it, it's too long. I mean, when I got into the business like 15 years ago, all of my new construction buyers were end user buyers, like back then, right? And they were buying long term, 3-4 years down the road. They know they're getting married. They know they want a house. They're renting now, right? So I would not be surprised even if you see more end users buying if the gap between resale and new construction shrinks a little bit. And especially in an environment of a sluggish rental market, you might just see fewer investors wanting to buy them. So 100%, I agree with you.
And would that be enough for both of you, I guess, to counteract the changes in immigration numbers? Or do you think that is not really going to impact the building side of things as much as we've seen it spike the rental market?
I think the immigration might impact rentals more than resale prices. And I don't know what Matt thinks, but I think it's going to be a bigger issue there probably.
Yeah, I think the immigration thing, like time will tell actually what it translates to. I saw some graph yesterday or chart yesterday showing that we were actually going to lose population for the next 2 years. I'm not sure how they're getting to that unless they're assuming a lot of temporary foreign workers are going to be leaving plus not bringing enough in, and that's going to result in in a small decline. But also, we have, I think, the least number of homes per capita in the G8, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And we've had a shortage of building for such a long time that even if we have a slowdown in immigration, I think it's going to take years for us to catch up to get to a more sustainable amount of housing. And then the question is, 5 years from now or whenever it is, what are immigration levels at that point? And if they're at like a healthy, because we still do need immigration, we shouldn't vilify immigration. We still need it. We're reproducing in Canada at record low rates, and at this pace, you could see population collapse over the next 3-4 generations. So we rely on immigration, but maybe you don't need 1.3 million people coming into the country every year. That might be a little bit too much. So I think if it gets back to a more sustainable level, then we can hopefully get back to a more sustainable and less kind of schizophrenic market. Because I think what everybody really needs is just stability. Like the development industry has been advocating for this for so long. Like, just don't change the rules on us midway through the game. Keep things stable. We don't want to see jumps in prices or the taps turning off. Like, we just want basic stability. Growth at 3% a year consistently. You can build a business off that. You can build good housing off of that, and you can make it sustainable for home buyers. Because you're not seeing massive swings in the market.
All right.
I think that's what we need to get back to.
Some sensible stuff there. I'm sure our viewers will have a lot of responses to the different issues raised. Thank you, Matt, so much for joining us. Maybe you can send us that board game really quickly. There's Diwali, there's all kinds of things happening.
Send me your address, I'll get you a copy. You guys.
That's great.
We can play sad games with our family members over the holiday season.
Look, if you need to have a very short board game with your kids, this is great. 3 turns and you're out of the game. So
funny but sad. But we thank you so much for your time, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
And I'll mention to all our viewers and listeners, we'll put show notes to all of this in our links to policy proposals and the other things we've been talking about in our show notes, as well as contact information for Matt as well, and for the show as well. So thank you as always for listening and joining, and we'll see you soon.